I am beginning to feel comfortable in this pulpit after 3 sessions and then one again tonight. In commenting on the preceding lecture, I want to recommend that all of you preachers especially purchase a book by Dr. Ronald Nash. Dr. Nash taught for years at Western Kentucky University at Bowling Green, has retired and now teaches for the Reformed Seminary in Orlando, Florida. The book's a small volume, I believe published by Zondervan, and it has the title, Is Christ Our Only Savior? It is extremely well done, which you probably know if you have read any of Dr. Nash's books. The West Virginia School of Preaching has done our brotherhood a favor by having these lectures on the topic that you see above my head today. I'm aware that many people would prefer that we not address these topics because they consider them to be negative. But they've been negative in a positive way, and they certainly are topics that we need to consider. I mentioned this morning a book written by the editor, the religion editor of the Los Angeles Times, Russell Chandler. The book is called Understanding the New Age, published by Word in Dallas, Texas. He mentions that there are always people, and I said something about that this morning, who like to have fun with movements such as this New Age movement. He tells of one guru who is out to lighten up the Enlightenment. His name is Swami Yogananda, the yogi from Muskogee. He does live gigs featuring the magical dance of True Delight. The comic also specializes in tantrum yoga, speed suffering, and healing cars through auto-suggestion. These spiritual practices are all discussed at Yogi Steve Berman's one-nighters in spots like Religious Science Creative Living Center in Orangedale, California. When he was asked, "What are your thoughts on reincarnation?" then he answered by saying, "I am a firm believer in reincarnation. After all, if we're supposed to recycle, why shouldn't God? You might say, I'm a born-again Krishna, and I subscribe to the born-again Krishna credo. You only go around 60 million times, so grab all the gusto." I suspect most of you know that the Old Testament speaks much more often with regard to the occult than is true of the New Testament. The Jewish people had that background, so they did not need a repetition of what you find in books like Deuteronomy and Isaiah and Ezekiel. If you have your Bibles, will you please turn to Deuteronomy 18. The Israelites were to maintain their separation from the Canaanite religion. The reasons for that are very obvious. If you know much about conditions in Canaan, at the time the Israelites left Egypt and went into the land of Canaan. And I read a few verses from Deuteronomy 18, beginning with verse 9. "When you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to do after the abominations of these nations." There are restrictions placed on the Jews that we might not understand did we not have some archaeological light on conditions in Palestine at the time the Jews came. There are a number of occult, which means hidden practices, found among the heathen nations. And Dean Miller mentioned a few minutes ago, Acts 19, what was occurring in the city of Ephesus. And here are some of them. "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that causes divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, And that's verse 10. Passing through the fire, technically called februation, referred to the practice of offering sons and daughters as sacrifices unto the pagan gods. The New International Version reads, you must worship the Lord your God. Let me read it right. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in sacrifice unto God. And that's Deuteronomy 12:31. Apparently, the purpose for offering these sons and daughters and sacrifices to their gods was to determine the course of events, or in some way to influence the events that would follow. That seems to be the reason that the Moabite king offered his son in sacrifice to the gods. And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men who drew their swords to break through even unto the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son that should have reigned in his stead, and offered him for a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. 2 Kings 3:26 and 27. Even the Israelites became so corrupt and so immoral that they were guilty of offering their children in sacrifice to Molech, or Moloch, Jeremiah 32:35. I suspect you remember a few years ago when some young men from the United States, and one in particular received a great amount of publicity, was killed and sacrificed in Matamoros, Mexico. These sacrifices involve the Santerian religion, which is a mixture of voodoo and Roman Catholicism. Some of these people actually took their body parts from the victims and cooked them and ate them. And when they buried these victims, they left a wire or a chain in the spine, and when the flesh rotted away, they pulled that part of the body out and wore it in locks around their necks. And the book I mentioned this morning, called Killer Cults, has a discussion of that. The Israelites also were forbidden to use divination. Divination includes using usually what are called supernatural means to discover the course of events. Water witching, reading tea leaves, peering into crystal balls, which is technically called scrying, palm reading, are attempts on the part of human beings to discern the future, or in some way to control the future. May I add as strongly as I am able, and I suspect all of you agree with this, but there are many members of the church that may not, none of this has any scientific merit. None of it. Astrology, divination, water witching have all been investigated from a scientific viewpoint, and not any of them make any sense whatsoever. All forms of the occult are displeasing to God. And the book I had in mind a moment ago, or the situation in Matamoros, Mexico, there is a book called The True Story of a Satanic Cult, Killings in Matamoros, Mexico, and it's written by Gary Provost and published by Pocket Books. Deuteronomy also mentions an observer of times. One version translates this expression, practices soothsaying. The NIV says sorcery. The Greek word which is translated sorcery or witchcraft is pharmakeia, used in Galatians 5:20, Revelation 9:21, and in other passages. Our word pharmacy comes from this Greek word. It probably indicates that the people use some kind of drugs in order to cast spells, and that's probably the reason that this word pharmakeia is used. Today we use drugs, the American people do, in similar ways, drugs like TCP and LSD and others. They were forbidden to be enchanters or to consult enchanters. The NIV translates that word, one who interprets omens. This would include studying the entrails of various animals to learn about the future, or interpreting heavenly signs for the same purpose. Then he mentions witches, and I'll not go into all of these, though I am tempted to do so. A charmer, a necromancer, a consulter with familiar spirits, a wizard. The word necromancer is from a Greek word, nekros, meaning dead, so somebody who consults with the dead, such as the witch of Endor, as you know. And there is much more in this chapter that I wish we had time to read, but I want to give you an indication that the selection of this particular topic is a very appropriate and very vital. This week, while I was in a meeting in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, this article appeared in the Winston-Salem Journal, Tuesday, October the 29th, 1996, and it has the title, Getting Truly in Touch. This article describes a practice that is quite common in hospitals, particularly among nurses in the United States. The nurses, and there's a picture of it here if you'd like to see it, do not touch the patients. It's not a massage treatment. They simply pass their hands over them and rearrange their electromagnetic fields, which is voodoo. In fact, some of chiropractic falls into that category. The Palmer method of chiropractic, Palmer himself was an occultist, and some of these are attempts to rearrange the forces in the human body. Now realize there are practices in medicine that can be legitimate, like acupuncture and acupressure, if they are not practiced with a New Age background. But when people begin to arrange the forces or the electromagnetic forces in your body, then you had better watch these people, because they are operating from very dangerous presuppositions. I bought 2 books while I was in the city of Winston-Salem. One has to do with the so-called new practices in medicine, alternate practices in medicine. And I wanted to be sure that I fully understood, and the book's written by a medical doctor. But let's talk about Arthur Ford for a while. This morning, as we close, I was giving you a list of many of the beliefs and practices of the New Age movement. That could go on, literally, for hours. And it would be possible, as I mentioned today, to have a whole lectureship devoted just to the New Age movement. There would be room for single-hour discussions, or perhaps even more, on the psychic phenomena and on many other practices, and let me mention some of them. Arthur Ford grew up in a background, he was born in Florida, in Titusville, Florida, but he was from the Disciples of Christ and received his bachelor's degree at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. He claimed to be a member of the Christian church, but not the conservative Christian church, but rather what we would call today the Disciples of Christ. Arthur Ford's New Age philosophy follows to a great extent what I discussed with you about Shirley MacLaine this morning. He was New Age before New Age was even called New Age. In other words, the beliefs and the practices that followed his life are those that are common in the New Age movement today. Arthur Ford lists a number of questions he was often asked when he delivered lectures on the occult, and he does not use the word occult, but we would. What kind of body do we have? Can we remember all things that happened during our earth life? When we get to heaven, and that's the question Paul asked, what kind of bodies are we going to have? And when we get there, can we remember all that we did on earth? And he said there are definite answers to all these questions. The Bible does not provide the answers, but Arthur Ford claimed to know the answers. He was the founder or co-founder of an organization called Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, a nationwide fellowship for exploring psychical and mystical aspects of life. And incidentally, Duke University has a department devoted to that particular aspect of this movement. And they've had it for years. Dr. J.B. Rhine, spelled R-H-I-N-E, as early as the 40s, was engaged in that form of study. Arthur Ford shares with Edgar Casey the distinction of being one of the truly great American mediums of the 20th century. At least that's what the book says. Oddly enough, these men, as I mentioned today, were both connected with the Restoration movement. They both claimed to believe that the Restoration movement was truly restoring New Testament Christianity. But the New Age movement is not a part of Christianity, as I'm sure you already understand. Arthur Ford met and was influenced by various mystics and gurus. He gives credit to Paramahansa Yogananda as one of the great influences in broadening and deepening his understanding between Eastern and Western religious concepts. In fact, these are his words. The great Swami had clear ideas about the nature of the world based on visionary revelations he regarded as utterly dependable. Now, if you listen to the speech preceding mine, then you know that these revelations are not dependable. They're outside God's revelation. But you would expect a man who received these revelations and promulgated them to think that they were dependable. Ford would give lectures, and then he would have a message period. According to the book, and the book is called The Life Beyond, he gave information during these periods that could not possibly have been prearranged and could not possibly have originated with anyone but the now discarnate individual who claimed to be the sender. Now, this is channeling, which I discussed briefly with you this morning. His control was a man by the name of Fletcher. Fletcher was the discarnate spirit who would reveal these messages to Arthur Ford. Arthur Ford claimed to have seen Fletcher at times, and at other times he simply felt him. And there is more to this part of it, but I want to get into his ideas, and these are quite common in the New Age movement. Arthur Ford, even though a member of the Restoration movement, denied the existence of hell. In fact, I have yet to read any member of the New Age movement, at least any prominent leader in the New Age movement, who believes in hell. Now, there is a new book entitled To Hell and Back, written by a physician, a cardiologist in the city of Chattanooga. I learned about him when I spoke at West Fayetteville on out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. And this doctor, Dr. Maurice Rawlings, said that one of his clients had an arrest of the heart, clinically died, and then he kept saying when he came back, when he was resuscitated, "Get me out of hell. I'm in hell. I see the flames." Most of the people who claim to have died clinically and gone to the world beyond see a great light, which they identify as being God, and they claim that they see departed loved ones. This man said, "I am in hell, and I want to be brought out of hell." So the book is called To Hell and Back, and written by Dr. Maurice Rawlings. I talked to Dr. Jim Humphreys, a member of the church in Jackson, Tennessee, who is also a cardiologist. And I asked him, in all of his years of practice, if he had ever had anybody who had gone beyond and come back and told these kinds of stories. And he said no. He had resuscitated and worked with many who were clinically dead, but never one time had they told that kind of story. But Arthur Ford says there is no hell. When an American Episcopal bishop by the name of Jim Pike lost a son, his son Jim committed suicide in New York a number of years ago. He made contact with Jim through a medium, through a channel, Ena Twigg, out of England. And in his talking to Jim, he said, "Have you met Jesus Christ?" And Jim said, "No, they don't talk about him over here." Wherever he was not in heaven. And yet he claimed there was no punishment and no judgment. In his lectures, Arthur Ford never tired of berating preachers, both ancient and modern, who tried to strike fear into the hearts of their hearers, particularly children, with horrendous stories of hell to come for those who misbehave. Well, I do not know any preachers who practice that, not among churches of Christ. We do preach on hell, do we not? I had a member of the church to tell me back several years ago that nobody preaches on hell anymore. And there is a new book written by John Braun with the title, Whatever Happened to Hell? Well, modern religionists would like to get rid of it, but it is still in the Bible. Now, there is some justification in the observation that Arthur Ford made. We ought not to scare children with stories about hell, but we need to preach what the Bible teaches. It is interesting to note that Jesus gave little authority to that kind of hell. And what Jesus is he talking about? Jesus said more about hell than anybody else. In Matthew 25, he said, "These on the left shall go away into everlasting punishment prepared for the devil and his angels." I do not understand how Arthur Ford, who claimed to be a Bible student, could make that kind of statement. For as many years, for many centuries, he says, too many peanut-minded, sour-souled bigots and power drivers have sought to dominate their flocks with threats of hell. Fear of hell preaching is, I think, as much responsible for our prevailing belief as anything else. If you preach on hell, that produces unbelief. Who wants to believe in an afterlife that is something unpleasant? And my question is, what difference does it make what you want to believe? What does God say? What has the Bible revealed? What is the truth? And we should believe the truth. Arthur Ford also believed, as Shirley MacLaine does, and most others in the New Age movement, in evolution. Now remember, this book was written about 1970, and he advocated the doctrine that is called recapitulation. And I'm sure all of you who have studied evolution understand that nobody believes that anymore. Not one scientist or evolutionist with whom I am acquainted believes in the recapitulation theory. Now, in case you have not studied evolution, let me summarize briefly what it says. Every individual goes through all the evolutionary stages of the race, so that when you look at an embryo and study it as it develops for 9 months in the mother's body, then you can see the lizard stage and the fish stage and all of these stages as that entity develops. Nobody believes that anymore. The most radical evolutionists, George Gaylord Simpson, the guy at Harvard who is so prominent, these men make fun of the idea. In fact, and I say this just in passing, but evolution is a dying theory. Oh, I don't mean that many of the evolutionists and the humanists and the agnostics have given up on it, but some of the most prominent evolutionists in the world have denied that evolution has any foundation in fact. Dr. Michael Denton, who is an Australian medical doctor and molecular biologist, wrote a book in 1986, number 1 on my list on evolution, called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. It is devastating. He denies every fundamental of evolution and then says, but I'm still an evolutionist. Of course, to deny evolution, to give it up, would mean you'd have to accept creation, and many scientists are unwilling to do that. Dr. Colin Patterson is an English evolutionist who has written extensively. He is director of the Great British Museum. He spoke to a scientific delegation, and he said to these men, for 20 years I have been studying evolution, and it dawned on me a few days ago that I know nothing about it. Nothing. And then he turned to his audience and said, does any one of you know anything at all, anything about evolution? And they never answered. And then he said, evolution not only does not produce any knowledge, it produces anti-knowledge. Dr. Philip Johnson from the University of California at Berkeley was in London and met with Dr. Patterson and asked him, did you make that statement? And he said, yes, I made that statement. And then he said, do you believe that? And he said, yes, but I'm still an evolutionist. you get the idea that people want to believe evolution, and that these people in the New Age movement certainly fall into that category. Another idea accepted by Arthur Ford is clairvoyance, and I'll not go into that extensively today. Mental telepathy. And that there is no death, and I mentioned that today, but I want to read a statement from his book. It may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died. And since nobody has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what happens after it? And he asserts that all of us have returned from the dead and have been reincarnated many times. Ford says of the revelations of Frederick Myers, he wanted to remove from the human mind once and for all the fear of death with the assurance that there is no death, only alterations in mode of consciousness. Of course, the Bible teaches an entirely different doctrine. Satan told Adam and Eve, "You shall not surely die." And I mentioned a while ago that many of the ideas in the New Age movement you can find in Genesis 3, and that's one of them. You are not going to die. But God said, the day that you eat of the forbidden fruit, you will die. Death was introduced into the world, and the New Testament says, it is appointed unto man once for all to die, and after that, the judgment. Now, I need the Bible to tell me what happens after death, whether or not we have any hope of a life to come, but I don't need the Bible to tell me that people die. I see people dead in funeral homes. I preach their funerals. But of course the Bible is the authority on the matter of death and the reason death came, and it also gives an answer to death. And that answer is through Jesus Christ our Lord. He also mentions that many people have had contacts with the dead. And that I mentioned a while ago is called necromancy. Now let me just give you a summary of many of the ideas that are prominent within the New Age movement. Monism. This is a doctrine that says all is one and one is all. Everything in the universe is composed of the same substance. Now that's different from pantheism, even though pantheism also is a part of the New Age movement. Pantheism says that all is God, and God is all. And that's the reason the New Age people say that we are God. Shirley MacLaine said, I am God. Everything is God. And that's pantheism. Mediums, and they've changed that today to mean, they use the term channeler rather than medium. And Arthur Ford says Jesus was a great medium. Page 60. Crystallography. I never dreamed that Americans of average intelligence and beyond and educated would ever believe that there is something mystical and magical in crystals. I never have been to a New Age meeting. I hope to go to one. They have one about every 4 or 5 years in the city of Huntsville, Alabama, and I want to go down, but they have hundreds and hundreds of all kinds of crystals. Edgar Cayce said that the planet Atlantis, and I'm sure you've read about Atlantis, one time in the Atlantic Ocean, a mighty empire that disappeared in the Atlantic Ocean. And that civilization on Atlantis was far beyond ours. They had developed, they knew about DNA. They had many inventions that it's taken us several hundred years to duplicate. But he said that they had jet aircraft on Atlantis, except they were not powered by jet fuel. They were powered by crystals. They had crystals so powerful that the beams went out in all directions, and these planes would fly up those beams, and they could travel much faster than our modern jets. Realities that this world is illusory. Automatic writing. Ruth Montgomery, at one time, was the Barbara Walters of the United States. She interviewed people like President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, very prominent woman in the world of publishing. She has written probably a dozen books. I have at least 6 or 8 of them, and have read them. And she says that she has not personally written any of these books. Arthur Ford and the people who have departed, the discarnate spirits, write the books through her hand. She sits down at her typewriter at 8 o'clock in the morning, turns her mind off, which is no particular responsibility, fairly easy to do, and then these discarnate spirits write through her fingers, and she knows nothing about what they have written until she gets up and reads it. They also have such things as automatic painting. Men and women in 1996 that can duplicate the work of Leonardo da Vinci or Rembrandt or the great masters, because these great masters in their discarnate state operate through the hands of modern painters and artists. Automatic painting. Reincarnation. And I want to say more about that in just a moment. Cosmic memory. There is an idea that there is some kind of great computer-type bank in the world that has every incident that has ever occurred, including every thought since the beginning of time. And this is called cosmic memory or Akashic records. Edgar Cayce believed that when he diagnosed illnesses, that he was simply tapping in to this cosmic memory. What Cayce would do, he would receive a call from a man in New York City who had a child who was sick or his wife was sick, and Cayce would ask him, what is the name of the entity? And that was his favorite expression, entity. And then he would diagnose what the illness was and tell what kind of treatment ought to be used. And if the treatment were not available, he would say there is a little drugstore down in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and sitting on the top shelf there is a bottle of medicine, and he would name it, that will heal the child. Now he said all of that came to him from the Akashic records, from cosmic memory. Cayce moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he died, and they established the Association of, well, it's ARE, Association of Research and Enlightenment, I guess is what it is. They have thousands and thousands of readings that Edgar Cayce developed on health and reincarnation and almost every other topic you can mention. Medical doctors, scientists, psychologists come from all over the world to study these records at Virginia Beach, Virginia. And that I cannot understand. But he claims that he has access to all the great events of all time. Bishop James Pike, and by the way, many theologians are getting into the New Age movement. Bishop John Shelby Spong of the Episcopal Church endorses some of it. Dr. Leslie Weatherhead of the Methodist Church, probably dead now, in London, he wrote a book on reincarnation 35 years ago. So many theologians, especially modernistic theologians, are getting involved in the New Age movement. After James Pike, Bishop Pike, lost his son, as I mentioned a while ago, then he made attempts to contact him through the New Age movement. Now, I want to give you some facts. And I know these are overwhelming. And I don't intend or don't believe that all of you are going to remember them. I don't remember them all. But I want to give you an overall picture of just how powerful the New Age movement is in the United States. Many New Age supporters see the New Age movement as potentially as sweeping as the Renaissance or the Protestant Reformation. That may sound boastful, but I really suspect that may be true. I know it is, unless we do something about it. They speak of what theologians call, or philosophers call, a radical paradigm shift, a shift in people's thinking. Russell Chandler gives these astonishing facts about various facets of the New Age movement. And these are the facts now that I want you to hear. I know you cannot remember them all, but he will give you a picture of what is happening. 34 million Americans are concerned with inner growth. And they don't mean spiritual growth like you and I would preach, including mysticism, according to the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. Nearly half of all American adults, 42%, believe they have been in contact with somebody who has died, up from 27% in a previous national survey 11 years earlier. There are a great number of people who've lost loved ones, a mother, a father, a child, and then wake up at night and there is the parent or the child standing at the foot of the bed. Dr. Moody, and I know most of you know that name, Raymond Moody, has written books called Life After Life, and in fact he's sort of the papa of this whole movement about resuscitation and seeing the light and the OBEs. He has a room in the state of Florida that he calls a scrying room. Scrying has to do with crystal ball gazing or looking into a mirror. And he brings people into his home, into that room, and allows them to look into it until they see a dead mother or a dead father and communicate with that person. Sociologist Andrew Greeley of the University of Chicago discovered that 60% of all adult Americans, more than 70 million people, claim to have had psychic experiences, such as extrasensory perception. Roughly 30 million Americans, about 1 in 4, now believe in reincarnation. About 25% of the American people believe in reincarnation. 14% endorse the work of spirit mediums, or what the New Agers often call trance channelers. Some have found that the New Age movement is the fastest growing alternative belief system in this country. In 1978, the Gallup poll indicated that 10 million Americans were engaged in some aspect of Eastern mysticism and 9 million in spiritual healing. Some of you may remember that in the early 1960s, C.S. Lewis said that the next greatest challenge to Christianity will be the Eastern religions. And that was long before they became the dominant force they are today in the United States. The same polling organization, that is the Gallup poll group, found that between 1978 and 1984, belief in astrology had risen from 40% to 59% among American school children. That really is a very disturbing fact. According to the results of a 1987 survey conducted by Northern Illinois University, 67% of American adults read astrology reports, while 36% believe these reports are scientific. A third of the American people believe that astrology is scientific. I had a very dear friend when I was a student at Freed-Hardeman, very devout Christian young woman, who married a doctor from Murfreesboro. When Molly and I moved to Murfreesboro in 1957, I made a reacquaintance with this woman and her doctor husband. He was a dentist. She was active in the church, taught Bible classes, but believed in astrology. And that I simply could not understand. She not only was a member of the church, she had a master's degree, somebody educated enough and knowledgeable enough about the Bible not to fall for this kind of idea. The Northern Illinois University survey also reported that more than half of the American people think extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth, a belief widely held within New Age circles. Dr. Norman Geisler, and I expect all of you preachers know that name, and I have heard and met Dr. Geisler, said in the big trial they had in Arkansas at Little Rock on evolution that these extraterrestrials are coming to Earth in the UFOs. And he said it in the trial, and it reached national audiences. And of course the lawyers for the ACLU rode him into the ground. I cannot believe that a man so intelligent, so educated, would make that kind of blunder. Many movie stars in the United States and many movies are promoting the New Age movement. I have never seen any of the Star Wars. I have absolutely no interest in it. But the force that they talk about is what the New Age people accept. Charlie's Angels, a television program, often discusses energy fields of the so-called chakras of the human body. There's supposed to be 7 points in the body that control the energy flow. The Last Temptation of Christ, and you remember that movie. I never saw it, would not go to see it, would be embarrassed if you said you did. The Last Temptation of Christ injects pantheistic and mystic thinking into a startling rendition of a fictionalized Jesus who doubts his messiahship and struggles with lustful temptations. Everything is a part of God, declares the tormented Christ. It is not God who will save us. It is us who will save God. Bad English, but you understand it. By battling, by creating, by transmuting matter into spirit. It is not God who saves us, but we save God. Atlanta broadcasting magnate Ted Turner, who thinks he is God, insists that America must elect a New Age president by the year 2000. I could make a comment, but it probably would not be appropriate. Marilyn Ferguson has written a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy, Personal and Social Transformation of Our Time. It has become a national bestseller. And I'm amazed at the number of people in the United States who endorse that kind of thinking. I wish I had time to talk with you about astrology and reincarnation and psychic phenomena and alternative medicines. Let me say one word about alternative medicine. Do you know what homeopathy is? Homeopathic medicine? Listen to your radio sometime. I often drive listening to WSM in Nashville, and they advertise homeopathic medicine. And there are homeopathic doctors. Homeopathy means that you take a medicine, whatever it is, and you dilute it thousands and thousands of times, 1 drop in 1,000,000 gallons. But that's supposed to have some kind of magical power. It's not the chemical element that does any good. It's the force, the power, the energy. And there are American doctors, and I bought a book on homeopathy when I was in Winston-Salem because I intend to do some radio sermons. But this is what is happening in the United States, and I wish I could talk with you more about it. The Lord willing, over the next 12, 15 months, I plan to do probably 20 or 30 radio sermons on the International Gospel Hour on the New Age movement. Let me mention this also, brother, before I close today. In June of next year, I will be debating a Seventh-day Adventist, John Osborne, in Chattanooga. We'll have announcements in the Gospel Advocate and perhaps in other papers, and if you get an opportunity, I hope you will attend the debate. As you know, Adventists normally will not debate. He's a kind of renegade. He does not have the total endorsement of the Adventist movement, but he will defend the Sabbath in a 4-day debate in Chattanooga. He's on 600 cable stations, and he's going to broadcast the entire debate on the cable stations and also on across the seas on radio. Thank you very much.